The strange part is, from the outside, Amish dating looks innocent. Quiet girls, polite young men, horse carriages, church gatherings, family dinners. People imagine simplicity, purity, tradition. That's exactly what I believed too, until I got old enough to actually experience it. And once I did, I realized something nobody talks about openly. The darkest parts weren't the rules themselves, it was the silence surrounding them. I remember the first time I was allowed to spend time alone with a young man. The sky was already dark outside. The house had become quiet. Most people had gone to sleep, and suddenly, I became aware of how nervous I really was. Not excited, nervous. Because nobody had explained what dating was supposed to feel like emotionally. People explained behavior, rules, boundaries, but emotions? Nobody touched that subject, honestly. I sat near the edge of the bed while he spoke softly beside me.
The room smelled faintly like candle wax and old wood. The lamp beside the wall barely lit the room enough to see clearly, and even though nothing dangerous was happening, my chest still felt tight, because deep down, I realized I had no idea what I was supposed to feel. I didn't understand it then. But emotional confusion becomes frightening when everyone expects confidence from you. That was the first thing that unsettled me about Amish dating, the pretending. Everyone acted like young people naturally understood relationships emotionally, but most of us were completely lost, and because nobody admitted confusion openly, everyone suffered privately instead. That's when something started to feel off. Not because dating itself felt wrong, because silence surrounded everything important. People outside Amish communities often hear stories about bundling, young couples sitting together late at night, sometimes sleeping beside each other before marriage under strict expectations, and outsiders usually react one of two ways, shock or fascination, but almost nobody talks about the emotional reality underneath it, the pressure, the confusion, the silence. Because imagine being young, barely understanding your own emotions, while suddenly navigating intimacy. Nobody prepared you for emotionally. That confusion changes people quietly. I remember one night after a gathering, walking home beside another girl named Hannah. The road was dark except for moonlight reflecting softly against the fields. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Then suddenly, she whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. "Do you ever feel scared during dating?" I looked at her immediately, because nobody asked questions like that directly, and before I answered, she laughed nervously and said, "I feel like everybody else understands things better than I do." That sentence stayed inside me for years, because I understood exactly what she meant. The fear wasn't always about rules. Sometimes the fear came from pretending emotional certainty you didn't actually feel. At the time, I told myself this was normal, that maybe adulthood simply felt confusing at first. But deep inside, something resisted that explanation, because confusion grows heavier inside silence, not smaller. One of the darkest parts of Amish dating wasn't strictness. It was emotional isolation. Young people often entered relationships carrying enormous emotional pressure, without language for any of it. Pressure to behave correctly, pressure to appear mature, pressure to avoid embarrassing yourself, pressure to avoid disappointing family expectations. And over time, many stopped trusting their own emotions completely. That realization frightened me later in life, because once people disconnect from their emotions, they become easier to control through shame, and shame existed everywhere. Not loudly, quietly, inside awkward silences, inside disappointed looks, inside rumors spreading after church. I remember hearing whispers about one girl who stopped seeing a young man after several months. Nobody openly attacked her, but suddenly, people spoke about her differently, carefully. Judgment hidden beneath politeness. That's when I realized something painful. Dating wasn't just personal, it felt public. Community expectations followed everything, and once expectations become public, fear grows larger too. Looking back, I think many young people stayed inside relationships longer than they wanted simply to avoid disappointing others. That's something outsiders rarely understand. The emotional pressure surrounding dating could feel enormous, especially for women. Especially women raised to prioritize obedience over honesty, night after night. Many of us kept pretending confidence, and every morning, we carried more emotional confusion privately, but that wasn't even the hardest part. The hardest part was believing everybody else handled things better than we did. That belief destroys people quietly. Because once someone thinks confusion is weakness, they stop asking for help completely. I didn't understand it then. But silence shapes relationships long before marriage ever happens. It teaches people which emotions deserve expression and which emotions should stay hidden. That emotional silence affected nearly everything: communication, trust, vulnerability, self-worth, everything. I remember one evening sitting beside the man I was dating while both of us barely spoke for almost an hour, not because we disliked each other, because neither of us truly knew how to emotionally open up honestly, and once silence becomes habit, even closeness starts feeling lonely. That realization broke my heart later in life, because humans need emotional safety, not just rules, not just appearances, real emotional honesty. But emotional honesty felt unfamiliar to many people growing up inside silence. That's the dark side nobody explains properly. Not horse carriages, not old traditions. Emotional loneliness. The feeling of carrying confusion privately while pretending certainty publicly. That's what damaged people most deeply. One older woman admitted something heartbreaking to me years later. We were cleaning dishes together after a gathering, and very quietly, she said, "Most of us entered marriage emotionally terrified." Then she smiled sadly and added, "But nobody thought we were allowed to admit that." I still think about those words sometimes, because they explain everything: the silence, the fear, the pretending, generations of people emotionally overwhelmed, while trying to appear spiritually and socially prepared. Looking back now, I don't think the darkest part of Amish dating was strict tradition itself. I think it was how little honest emotional guidance existed around it. Because young people don't magically understand relationships emotionally. They need honesty, safety, conversation, guidance. Without those things, confusion becomes shame, and shame keeps people silent. That understanding took me years of slowly learning words I didn't have growing up. Emotional suppression, fear, pressure, people-pleasing, isolation. Things many people experience deeply, without knowing how to describe them. And once you finally have language for your emotions, your entire past begins making sense differently. Not perfectly, but honestly, if you're still listening. Maybe part of this story feels familiar to you too. Maybe you grew up somewhere, emotions stayed hidden, where appearances mattered more than honesty. Where people silently carried pressure nobody discussed openly. If you did, you're not weak, and you're not alone. That's something I wish somebody had told me much earlier. Some things stay with you, not as memories, but as emotional habits your body learns long before your mind fully understands them. And maybe that's the part nobody talks about. Not the dating itself, but the emotional silence hidden quietly underneath it. And maybe, speaking honestly about it now, is the first step toward finally breaking that silence. If this story connected with you, leave a comment below. Sometimes hearing, "me too," changes everything. And if you want more honest stories, people usually stay silent about. Subscribe. Because maybe these conversations matter more than we realize.